Now, is the majority of a sound designer's work done in pre-production, in actual production, or post-production?
Well, I wish that a lot more of it was done in pre-production.
It's all last minute, isn't it?
Yeah. Almost all of the sound designer's work is done in post-production, and it's a shame because sound is, film is supposed to be a collaborative medium, and I think when it works really well, it is a collaborative medium. But the main tragedy of sound in movies is that it's one craft that gets affected by all the other crafts, that if creative decisions in camera work and lighting and blocking of the actors and the actors' performances and editing and every other conceivable craft, all of those creative decisions determine in a way what we as sound people can do or should do. On the other hand, sound is almost never in a position to affect creative decisions in any of those other crafts. And I think that's truly a shame, and it kind of eliminates sound as a collaborative partner in a sense. And I think on some of the films that have used sound best, Apocalypse Now springs to mind. There were people very early in the process on that film thinking about sound, experimenting with sound, speculating about sound, and the result of a lot of those experiments and a lot of that speculation wound up affecting creative decisions in other areas. I think of that classic shot of the ceiling fan in Captain Willard's hotel room in Saigon.
Yeah.
He's lying there in his bed looking up the ceiling fan, and the ceiling fan is turning. And instead of hearing a ceiling fan, you hear a helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason you hear a helicopter is because that's what Captain Willard is hearing. That's his point of view. He's reliving all of these experiences he's had in Vietnam. So it's a way for sound to tell you a lot about what's going on in that character's head without ever having to say anything in words about it. He's seeing a ceiling fan, and he's remembering having been in some battle where there was the blades of a helicopter turning.
Now, that was one of your first jobs, was it not, Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, it's actually the first film I ever worked on. I was extremely lucky. I worked in public radio for many years and did some work in music studios also, and moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1970s, in the mid-70s, and continued to do radio work here in San Francisco and Berkeley, and started thinking about working in movie sound, and finally made a very lucky phone call to Walter Murch, who was editing Coppola's films. And I said, I've never worked on a movie before, but I've done lots of other kinds of sound work at this point, done a lot of recording of sounds, nature sounds, etc., and sound editing for radio dramas, but never worked on a movie. And he said, well, why don't you come down and we'll talk about it. And I went down, and they were to this facility where they were mixing the sound for American Graffiti. Actually, American Graffiti had come out several years before, but it had been released in mono, and they wanted to do a stereo version of it. And so I sat there all day long and watched Walter Murch remix this film that had been mono, the sound had come out of one speaker in the center of the screen, into stereo. And at the end of the day, he said, why don't you write me an essay about what you've seen today? And I thought, well, that's kind of a strange approach for somebody like me who might want to get a job in the movie business. And I assumed that he did that with everybody, and I didn't find out until 2 or 3 years ago that I'm the only person he ever asked to write an essay. But I did write an essay, and he liked what I wrote, and so he hired me to work on Apocalypse. And I worked on the film for about a year, and I spent about half the time recording sound effects, helicopters and gunshot, a fly buzzing in a window for that opening sequence with Willard in the Saigon hotel room. I where I spent about a week constructing a fly habitat.
Wow.
And
that's dedication.
Got a butterfly net and caught flies behind restaurants in Fisherman's Wharf.
That's great.
Because Walter wanted a very specific kind of sound of this fly buzzing against the window pane.
See, that's the kind of thing that most people really don't hear about or think that when they're watching a film that much time and effort goes into it. So this is great stuff.
Yeah, it's somebody who goes in and casually watches a film, or maybe even somebody who knows quite a lot about, in a general way, about filmmaking, I think is very unlikely to imagine the level of effort that's put into the soundtrack of even a more or less average film, to say nothing of something like Apocalypse Now.
Now, where do sound designers usually start? Is it the script? Like, most foundations of a film begin with a script. Do you read the script and start imagining sounds in your head, and then, you come to the director with ideas? How does that work? How do you approach a film when it's first handed to you?
Well, on the typical film, if there is such a thing, I read the script, and usually around the time I'm hired is early in post-production, and so there's usually some kind of a picture cut at that point. The movie exists in some form, though it needs a lot of refinement, and so I'll watch that, and we go through what's called a spotting session with the director, and which means we watch the whole movie, typically spend about a day watching the movie, and the director will tell me what he or she thinks in terms of sound for each scene.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things we talk about is whether it's going to be a naturalistic approach, meaning whether the sound should be realistic and completely believable in every scene, or whether there are certain scenes, or maybe in the whole movie, we want to stylize the sound in certain ways or exaggerate it in certain ways for dramatic effect. Ways that might not be absolutely believable and naturalistic and realistic, but still be true to the thrust, the emotional and dramatic thrust of the scene. And sometimes we talk about fairly specific things, but usually not. But it's mostly the spotting session is about what sounds to focus on, what sounds not to focus on, and it's useful to the sound designer to get an idea, if there's any ambiguity about it at all, of what the director wants the audience to feel in each scene.
Now, I've always wanted to ask you, can you turn your ears off ever? Are you walking around a mall or an airport and just thinking of sound design ideas? Do you carry a tape recorder with you? Are you always thinking in movie?
I don't carry a tape recorder with me as much as I used to.
Uh-huh.
I do occasionally. And yeah, sure, I'm able to turn my ears off in a sense,
uh-huh.
quite a bit of the time.
Yeah.
And when I go see a movie, people often say, well, when you see a movie, aren't you just thinking about sound all the time? And the answer is no. If the movie's any good, I get just as lost in the movie as anybody else does. If I'm not enjoying the movie very much, then I begin to think in technical terms and wonder, well, how did they do that? Or why did they do that? But that's only when the movie has lost me dramatically for whatever reason, which may either be the movie's fault or my fault. But yeah, sure, I'm able to turn off my ears occasionally. But I'd say on some level, I'm almost always open to being influenced by a sound and aware of the sound and able to think about how I might be able to use the sound in a certain way. What if I played that sound backwards and played it an octave lower in pitch? Maybe that would go with a certain scene. Thoughts like that
Seems like a lot of
several times a day, I have to admit.